Hello, and welcome to Nomadic Diaries, the re-entry series. I'm Doreen Cumberford, the host.
And I'm Linda Mueller, the co-host. Hello, everyone. This is Linda Mueller, and I'm here with my co-host, Doreen Cumberford. Hello, Doreen.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for listening.
And also our guest, Sally McGregor. Hi, Sally. Thanks for being here.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Today, we're talking about expat grief as it relates to repatriation. But before we get into that, I'd really like to introduce Sally to everyone. Sally, otherwise known as Dr. McGregor, is a licensed clinical psychologist and an adult TCK. So for those who aren't familiar with that acronym, it stands for third culture kid, meaning those who were raised in a culture other than their passport country or that of their parents for a significant part of their childhood. So Sally, can you just tell us briefly what makes you a TCK?
Yes, I spent the first 13 years of my childhood abroad and then moved back to the country of my passport country, but somewhere I'd never lived, the US. I was in China for most of my childhood. That makes me a TCK.
It does.
Very exciting. And your parents, are they American, I assume?
They are, yes. Both my parents are American.
Okay, so you all moved back to the US then. Okay.
Right.
Great. Well, Sally used some of those experiences, I'm sure, that she had when she was young to found Wonderwall Psychology. It's a private practice dedicated to the well-being of those living an international life. And that includes expats, TCKs, adult TCKs, global nomads, digital nomads, something very close to Doreen's heart, military families, veterans, and so on. Sally finds topics surrounding relationships, attachment, emotional health, identity, and culture to be the core of how we come to be who we are. She enjoys collaborating with those serving globally and domestically nomadic clients, and we are honored that she's agreed to talk to us today about expat grief. So, Sally, we typically hear about expat grief in terms of people who are living abroad and they lose a relative back home, or they move abroad and then they're missing friends and family somewhere else. So with respect to repatriation, how would you describe expat grief?
So interesting. I mean, to that first point you brought up of what we traditionally hear about expat grief, I wonder if either of you have had this experience where when a distinct grief or loss happens abroad, say someone passes away or someone receives a major health diagnosis, sometimes those families disappear or that person disappears.
Mm-hmm.
And we're sort of left as a community going, whoa, what just happened? And it can be very abrupt and it's unique in itself. Grief, the more sort of common known types of grief and loss are distinct and different among expats. Repatriation is so interesting, right? Because it's so normalized as part of life in the expat community. So we don't necessarily regard it as a potentially very intense loss. And each time that we're making a move abroad, same thing. We don't necessarily appraise that to be a loss. In Doug Oda's book, he speaks about how often in his presentations would say that TCKs experience more loss during childhood than most adults do their entire lives, right? So there's all this compounded grief. And then you go to repatriate, right? It might be a country that you have lived in before, a country you have some familiarity with, or maybe somewhere you've never lived before. So there's all these expectations, especially if you sort of look like you should fit in, whatever that means in the context you're in. There's an expectation, I think, from your community sometimes that it should be easy. And so maybe you internalize that and think it should be easy when it can be really painful and difficult and strange.
Oh, definitely. Yes, I think we
definitely.
can. Doreen and I have both repatriated multiple times, and I think we can relate to exactly what you're saying.
Between us, I think we've counted 9.5 times, and it's equally strange every time.
I wonder, can I ask you all that when you say strange, what has shown up for you or been sort of stood out in terms of the difficulty of repatriating?
Well, I would say one of my more dramatic repatriations was after spending 15 years in Saudi Arabia, and I wrote a book about it. And that was a very healing way of processing the grief that I was experiencing, because I was not only missing the memories of the life that I thought I would be returning to in the US. In the meantime, it had changed a lot, although I had visited. But I was also grieving the loss of Saudi Arabia, which had absolutely ironed its way into my soul. And so I was grieving the sounds and the smells and the tastes and the calligraphy. And I actually had the sense of my senses grieving. So that is the most potent grief experience that I have had in repatriation.
I'm going to jump in with a little like micro memory of repatriating to Chicago, which was my most recent repatriation, because I've repatriated all different ways, to places I didn't want to go to places I'd lived in before, not lived in before, all of that. The only common thread in my repatriations is that I never wanted to leave my host country when it was time to repatriate. Mm-hmm. So I'm one of those ones that'll start grieving the second I know we're leaving. But we got back to Chicago, and I actually had never lived here before full time. So I was super excited to explore this new city. And I get to the grocery store, and at first I'm excited because there's so many options, and I'm standing in the milk aisle and I start crying because there were 7,000 kinds of milk, soy, dairy, 2%. And I'm thinking, I just want milk. And everything that I'd sort of squashed down because I was excited to explore Chicago just came bubbling up. So that was strange to me.
Yeah, it can come out of nowhere and be confusing. And yeah, there's just this huge range of emotions that comes up, and it can surprise you.
Yep. We wanted to talk to you specifically, Sally, about this idea of hidden grief.
Yeah.
Because, when you lose people and you're overseas, it's a person you've lost. And if you move back, you've lost a place. It's very, very different. And I think that no one that we interact with has any concept that there is grief happening in this person. So can you talk to us a little bit about that and how that works, please?
Yes, absolutely. I think it could be helpful to sort of go through the definitions, because I think in what you said, you named two different sorts of grief.
I did.
The ambiguous loss, and then this hidden grief as well. So we'll sort of touch on both of those. And I like what you said earlier about the things that you're grieving can feel sometimes sort of intangible or maybe hard to explain. Sometimes it's sort of a cultural anchor or a sense of that version of yourself that lived in that place. Place identity is a no-brainer for people who've never moved or who are very tied to place. And the place identity is something you take for granted, I think, when you have it, but it's quite confusing when you don't. So I just agree on this piece of it being sort of intangible, sometimes the things you're missing, because part of who you are is context dependent. So the two different kinds of grief, I think it'd be super useful to define perhaps are...
Thank you.
Yeah, ambiguous grief and loss. So a lot of folks who have heard of this at this point have read some of Pauline Boss's work. And this is when a loss is unclear because it either involves someone being physically present but psychologically absent, or alternatively physically absent while psychologically present. So as we were talking about before, when there's a death that happens, there's a clear expectation that grieving will occur most of the time. When a relationship ends or something like that, it can be more confusing. Other examples are someone being diagnosed with dementia, where they're sort of slipping away in some ways, but they haven't passed. A natural disaster, someone going missing, someone moving, someone struggling with substance use, divorce, these pieces where maybe we don't appraise it in the same way. The more ambiguous a loss is, the harder it is to reconcile and overcome. So for the expat repatriating, for the TCK perhaps repatriating, these relationships, sense of home, a prior life, it's not people, they themselves and people around them can be confused about whether a distinct loss has taken place. This sort of plays actually right into the hidden grief that you're talking about. So hidden grief is really the same concept as disenfranchised grief. And so that's a term that was coined by Dr. Kenneth Joka in 1989. You'll remember that because Taylor Swift has an album called 1989. She was born the same year that disenfranchised grief was created. So that's when you need
Does she know that?
Probably not. We should let her know.
Oh, okay.
Helpful for us studying for our test on types of grief. So with hidden grief, with disenfranchised grief, it's when a loss occurs, but it's not acknowledged socially as important or significant, right? So because the losses of that a TCK or an expat experiences are, sort of numerous, culturally normalized, not clearly defined, there's a higher risk of their grief becoming disenfranchised, sort of not seen.
So are there, since it's hidden, are there signs that an expat or an immigrant who maybe moved home unexpectedly is experiencing this grief? Are there signs, or like when does it typically surface? Do you have any idea of either of those?
That's such a good question. I think sometimes I wonder if you all have experienced this too. Comparisons to a prior place. Nothing wrong, of course, with it makes sense to compare the new place with a prior place, but some people can be very stuck in that pattern of it's part of grieving that they're holding on so tight to what they loved about that place. It's hard not to appraise everything new in the new place as not measuring up, right? And I think that's part of a sign that you're still grieving something you really loved. Sometimes reluctance to integrate into a new place, symptoms of depression, certainly moodiness, this feeling of stuckness, isolation, depression, those are some of the things that can show up. Also, I think another really important piece around that is sometimes I think it's important for expats to be able to tell their stories and have them heard. You would both totally agree with this from what I know about you. And it can be hard sometimes to talk about expat life outside of an expat context because we worry about being perceived as unrelatable, maybe arrogant about cultural exposures that you've had, right? Maybe not grounded in reality. All of that can lead to distancing behaviors and relationships. And ultimately, we want to be close to people. So that can be really hard. You can feel sort of silenced a bit.
When you can tell your story effectively, Sally, does that help with building bridges with other people across that grief process?
I certainly think so. I think being able to own your story, to feel good about how you are talking about it. Sometimes if you're having a tough time grieving something, people will ask, how are you doing? And that can feel, if you've ever experienced grief or a loss and someone has said that to you, that can feel, it's so kind, right? Well-intentioned. And it can feel really overwhelming. Like, I don't know how to answer. So sometimes I'll talk to folks about coming up with a line like, I have good days and bad days, but I'm moving through it. Or something like that. That way they've sort of satisfied the question, they've said something that's authentic and true, and they can sort of finding something to say. So I think that piece is helpful, and you'll decide based on your relationship with the person you're talking to how much you do and don't want to share and how much they'll understand. But I think being able to articulate, narrative therapy is an interesting thing to look into around narrative therapy with expats on this topic, because it would explain quite articulately why being able to tell our story is important. Yeah, I do think it's helpful. And there are people who will understand, right? There are people who will understand.
For sure. I think that's why it's really helpful when you repatriate to find other people to be in your community who've also lived an international lifestyle, or maybe they just really like to travel, because I think there's that bond of like, I get it, for people that have lived through some sort of similar circumstance.
Yes. I also think there's a lot of opportunity. The more interesting your life has been, the more opportunities there are to be misunderstood, because there are people that will get different parts of you and maybe not the full picture. And as you have more unique and diverse and interesting experiences, less people are going to have the exact same life you had, right? So it is important, I think, to orient towards looking to where you do connect with people. When you meet with somebody, can I talk to this person about? What do I connect with them on? I'm going to focus on that, because that's a nicer way to live than focusing on all the ways you don't.
Yeah,
100%.
I think that's a very good point, is finding the overlap and finding what's in common. But at the same time, I've experienced that where I feel like there are parts of myself that don't get exercised or don't get or parts of the story that will never get told if
Mhm.
I'm constantly evaluating and worrying about, how it's going to be received. Is
Yeah.
that something that we carry for a long time?
Worrying about how your story will be perceived.
Yes, yes.
I think there's always some level of impression management that we're all negotiating around how we'll be, perceived and what people will think of us. And some of that's adaptive, it's to fit into an environment. We're all sort of programmed to look to belong. And, some of those parts of you that you feel you need to hide sometimes the best parts of you. And so finding people who you can be yourself with and who get that and show up for that, I do think is important to remind yourself that it's okay. I think we're also moving into this interesting space in pop culture and maybe pop psychology around authenticity. Sort of be yourself, be vulnerable, get out there. I think it's empowering to show up as yourself. And I don't deny that there are barriers to that and that can be challenging. But the only way to find your people is to be yourself. Otherwise, you're going to find
Oh,
people that don't fit.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. I think it's interesting as expats, especially if you've had multiple experiences in different countries, is what do we share and what do we hide? What do we reveal and
Yeah.
what do we say? And who do we save it for? I think all of those subjects are just, really, really curious to dig into.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
one thing I wanted to add is that I feel like I've noticed myself not feeling like I have to share that I've lived overseas. Like there's been times where my daughter switched schools and people are like, well, where did she come from? And I felt like I had to say, ACS Hillingdon in London. I wanted to say like, well, this is where she came from. And I've actually found it comforting that we'll be in a round and people will be talking about something international. And I don't feel like I have to interject and be the international person. I feel like I'm more intentional of who I choose to share with. And I think for me, that feels like a
Yeah.
sign that I've reached a different level of my repatriation. So I think
Yeah.
for a long time, my life was attached, my identity was attached to my corporate career. Then it was attached to being this international person. But now I think I feel this sense of confidence of I am who I am with all these different experiences. And it's not tied to a location or to a
So
corporation.
neat.
It's kind of freeing. So I
Yes.
think it's all that to say that just being aware of our own thoughts and behaviors can be very empowering.
Absolutely.
So, what are some of the signs that, our listeners are people who are either about to repatriate and are listening in today because they want some tips and hints or they want some groundwork preparation for the experience, or
Yeah.
perhaps they're people who've been home for a while. They've already gone through all the processes of leaving and landing and are now actually in the trenches.
Mhm.
What sort of signs should they look for, Sally?
Yes, great question. Perhaps first I'll speak to the individual and then maybe more of the family system. Should someone be repatriating with a family? And I'd love to hear you all's thoughts on this as well. We live in an increasingly digitally connected world. So there is something nice about the fact that you can stay connected to folks on social networks and avoid sort of abruptly severing a relationship. Obviously, it's different than when you live in the same space, but it is nice to maintain a thread sometimes, and people have different preferences on how frequently they stay in touch. I try to make a point, even when I'm busy, if I think about someone or miss them, to
Mhm.
reach out. Even if when I'm reaching out, I'm saying, I am so busy right now, and I want you to know I thought about you today, and I hope we can be in touch soon.
Mhm.
It's sort of like maintaining a thread is helpful for me. A huge thing is kind of normalizing the range of thoughts and emotions that can occur throughout the process. You might find times that you're totally okay with the move, you're happy with it, or you feel sort of numb, or you feel really upset, or you feel guilty. This huge look at sort of the feelings wheel online, and you can point to the different emotions that you're feeling at any given time, and that's all normal. I think sometimes we feel guilty for how we feel. And so it's nice to just kind of develop that vocabulary and normalize it. Being able to realize that it is a massive shift, and appraising your loss and your grief as legitimate as you're transitioning, talking about what you miss and what you lost and gained in each move. If you're moving with a partner or with family or, with other folks, it can be helpful to, have a conversation about it because you're going through a unique experience together, and coming together. Moving is a stressor, and sometimes it can create tension, right? And deciding it's us against the problem, like we're not mad at each other, we're mad.
Yes. Yes.
Getting on the same team is useful.
Yeah.
And then, one other thing is, you have a relationship, let's say you're repatriating and you're not going to be living abroad again. You have a relationship to your expat life while you're living it, and you have a relationship to your expat life after you have repatriated, even if it's decidedly forever, right?
Definitely.
It never leaves you. It's a part of who you are, because you may have that kind of, well, am I really an expat? It's, and it's very, like you said, Doreen, it's ingrained in me, it's very strong. I guess the other piece I want to make sure I address with the family piece is that, children make sense of losses differently based on their cognitive and emotional maturity, and at each developmental level. So the way that you speak with them about it is different. There's all sorts of good books out there for assisting with that. And sometimes, as parents are trying to navigate their own transition, children are having their own reactions, and they can all show up at different times and look different, and just recognizing that that's normal. And children are often very well attuned to the responses of their parents. So, one example is they may subvert their own negative emotions for the sake of grieving parents, or they may really be sort of mirroring your reactions, taking a cue from you. And that's a lot of pressure on a parent to handle it perfectly so that my children, so I think just recognizing all of that is really important. Sometimes we can move into kind of overly focusing on the positive aspects of moving to our children, and then it can minimize the grief a bit. Of course, great to be positive and focus on what is gained and not just lost. You will make new friends, and these are new opportunities, and also being there to listen when there's something they're upset about losing, and that's okay, and that you can sit in that together, and we all kind of co-regulate each other. And it's a unique, I think that's another thing. It's a unique family unit, the expat family, isn't it? They go through so much together, and so there's a lot of opportunities to be close.
It's important to understand what the flags are that someone is experiencing this hidden grief, and then also to have some solutions on standby, because as family members, you could, as you said, go through the reverse culture shock, for example, at a different rate. And it's helpful to know, to understand that, to have that awareness in advance so that you know how to handle it and you don't think it's because of something else. Or at least it's sort of the first place you can start with questioning what's going on. What are you feeling right now? What's going on for you? So thanks for sharing all of that.
Yes. One last piece around that. I think in terms of when you're leaving a place, having some ritual for goodbye to a place, I think is helpful. How do you say goodbye to people, places, things? Do you write a letter? What are the last places you visit? How do you commemorate that? And then when you return, are there pieces that we want to hang on to? Do we want to have dumplings every Christmas because that's our family thing? Whatever it ends up being, how can we maintain a connection? I think that, that's really neat because it's celebrating it. It's going, what were the best parts of this? And we get to continue to celebrate this in this way. And grief is love, right? It's sort of the grief is worth the love. Like, would you rather have zero rich and meaningful experiences and relationships and then experience no grief? Because that's the alternative, is we stay disconnected and we don't live, and then we don't have to grieve. But that's not a great way to live either, right? So it's just important to know that there's a Winnie the Pooh quote that says, how lucky am I to have something that makes saying goodbye so hard?
Yes.
God, I just think that's so poignant every time I hear it.
Okay, I think I've got some sweat going into my eyes right now.
Yeah.
I need a tissue. Yeah, that's true. It's really a powerful quote.
Yes, to celebrate it. And what's missed, last thing on that, sometimes, there's this dialectical behavioral therapy is one modality in psychotherapy, not important to know the details of it. But one thing it talks about a lot is this present moment focus. And one of the examples they give is this is so familiar for parents. When your kid is 6, you're missing how cute and snuggly they were
Yes.
at 3, or when they
Yes.
were infant. Of course, you forget all the hard parts of those phases, right? But you
Right.
miss it. And then it's sort of like a reminder that you will miss this age in 3 years. So be
Yes.
present for it and just appreciate it for what it is. And
Yeah.
remind yourself you don't want to lose out on the moment by missing the past, and, all of it.
Very, very true. Very true. What strategies or resources would you recommend? So if someone is listening and they acknowledge that they are feeling some grief or they're processing some grief, even if it's, sometimes I get the feeling that subconsciously I'm processing grief. It
Yeah.
doesn't always come and hit you on the head and say, "Hey, you're grieving over here." It's a very it's sort of an energetics, like this dull feeling. What strategies, number one, what strategies would you suggest to people? And number two, do you have some resources for them?
Yeah, great question. Psychotherapy, obviously, I'm a proponent of
Yes.
finding a therapist and talking to them about it, particularly one that has, some cultural competency in this area or something similar. If you're worried your therapist won't understand you, do your best job to explain it and see how that goes. I wouldn't rule anyone out if you do feel connected to them in other ways, but they're maybe not an expert in this area, right? Connections can happen. Grief journaling, there's some prompts out there. If you sort of look up online, you can find a number of prompts for grief journaling. Another thing that it can be useful, if you sort of Google, funeral traditions or ceremonial things that each culture does around grief and loss, it might help you understand kind of the standards you're setting for yourself around how you should be coping with grief. Sometimes we have this expectation, we go through specific stages or something. And so understanding kind of the cultural messages you've been fed around grief and how that impacts you. Finding, and let's say therapy or grief journaling aren't your thing, find someone that you can talk to. Find someone you can talk to, find a good friend, create a social community around it. It sounds like, Linda, you've been really done a really lovely job around creating that. Be yourself and you'll find your people. And then you'll
Right.
feel less
Yeah,
alone, right? And less
exactly.
isolated.
Well, and that's the most sustainable way to make friends, right? If you are yourself, then your people will find you and you will find them.
Totally, totally.
I just have to say that I had one little experience of handling grief, and that is now that as I'm living as a retiree in Mexico, we celebrate Day of the Dead, and Day of the Dead was it was a tradition that I knew about, but I'd never really experienced, and now I'm just so excited that no matter where I die, yeah, this is something that I can take with me. I think it's always incorporating the new experience. Even being back in your home culture, you can discover different religions, different faiths, different ways of processing it, right? And so I'm adding that now to my menu, as it were, and building things like altars and actually offering to build altars for other people is great. I've discovered is a great way. It's very fun and very creative, and also I find doing something with the grief, moving or somehow moving the energy forward seems to help. So that was just my little 2 cents work. I had
Love
to make
that.
a little plug for Mexico here.
Yeah, I love that. Making it your own as well, which I love.
At one point I realized that I have a global soul. And so I don't I've bounced in and out of the United States. And every time we repatriated, we thought it was quote unquote forever. And so each time I came back, I looked at it like, this is just another chapter in my life. And I can continue to live an international lifestyle, even if I'm in my passport country. And I'm fortunate now that I live in Chicago and I've found a way to surround myself with people with international experiences, and there's great restaurants, et cetera. But there's always a way. And it just takes that initiative. And I think that's helped me move through the grief of what I've given up in my host countries. I've chosen to bring certain parts of it back because, like Doreen said, they're integrated in who I am as a person. But I'm also choosing to live this way with the same mentality that I had when I lived abroad. So I think that's helped me process the grief. But, like you said, it still will pop up every once in a while. I mean, wow, it's been X number of years since I lived in that country, but I'm feeling it like it was yesterday today.
Yes.
So it's just being aware, I think.
Definitely. And I think it can feel complicated in terms of your ownership of an experience that is profoundly a part of you, but also is maybe sort of distinct from who you are. For example, I grew up mostly in Asia. I'm not Asian, right? So to claim any of that culture feels very sort of problematic and complicated. And yet it was this massive part of my childhood. So I think also just sort of understanding that and making sense of that is a big task as well, right? There's a lot of pieces around it, but I like what you all are naming around how you can celebrate it and integrate it and acknowledge its impact on you and how it becomes part of your process.
And you begin to live it. And I think as you live it and it works its way through your system so that it's not such it's not such an ouch or it's not so painful. It's not so obvious. It just becomes who you are. I know around our house, we have things from Japan, things from Africa, things from Saudi, things from the US, things from Scotland. And it's kind of like walking through the story of my life every day. And my story has different chapters.
Yes.
And that's a safe way to grieve. So people can come and look at these things and ask questions about them. And then that's a good place to tell your story. So I found that is a great trick to managing grief.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. To honor it and have it. You're not sort of hiding it away or ignoring it. You're getting in touch with it.
Right. So is there anything we haven't covered that you think that you would like to share with our listeners that are sort of the high points of this?
We're increasingly all quite lonely as a society. And I think that's something important that we've touched on today is finding community is really important. And I recognize that there's barriers to that, but I think pushing yourself to put yourself out there and present as your authentic self is really important. There's a lot of connections that can be missed without doing that. So just reminding yourself that social piece is massively integral to your mental health. And when we feel depressed, sometimes we isolate, and that's exactly the opposite of what we need to be doing when we're depressed.
Very, very good point. So where can our listeners find you, Sally? How is the best way for them to reach out or get in touch with you for some strategies, some connection, some therapy, or some resources?
Yeah, absolutely. So my practice is Wanderwell Psychology PLLC. The website is www.wanderwellpsychology.com. wanderwellpsychology@gmail.com is my email if anyone wants to reach out to me directly. I'm also on Instagram, same name, wanderwell.psychology.
Thank you so much for all of the resources that you sprinkled throughout the episode, because I think this is a really rich discussion full of actual takeaways that people can use to help themselves. So thank you for all of those resources and references.
Yes, and I will say, there's not some major book I would promote necessarily, but there's a lot of great books out there on grief and, prompts for journaling, and also, as we know, expat-specific stories and memoirs, and those can be really healing and helpful to read.
Good point.
And very helpful to write. Just had to put a plug in.
Yes, there you go. There might be one coming soon you can refer to, right?
Oh, yeah, well, I already have one here.
Oh, perfect.
That was the
first. There is one coming.
But there will be more.
Good. It's a service.
Thank you for this. This was wonderful. It was a great conversation. We appreciate your perspective, your experience, and your professionalism. And we do invite our listeners to please reach out and connect with Sally. And thank you for today.
Thank you both. Thank you for what you're doing. It's lovely. And I wish you a lot of luck. Let me know if I can be helpful.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye. Take care.
Bye.